On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood in front of a special joint session of Congress with the goal of inciting fervor for space travel in the American people. A month prior, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had become the first man in space, and Kennedy was desperate for America to catch up. The president stood in front of America's lawmakers and declared that by the end of the decade, an American would land safely on the moon. He made this claim despite the fact that NASA had neither the plan nor the technology to make such a thing happen. In 1962, Kennedy made the same claim to the American public, speaking from a stadium in Houston. He described space as being a new frontier, inspiring fervor and a pioneer spirit in the Americans listening. The 1960s were notable for that pioneer spirit, not just in space exploration, but the exploration of equality, justice, and peace. Second-wave feminism was on the rise, focusing its efforts on matters of sexuality, sexual identity, and female professionalism. The civil rights movement was in full swing, with years of struggle for racial equality already behind it by the time Kennedy made his speech. Perhaps most notably, decades of economic and military tension between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War were at a peak of militarization, and councils for nuclear disarmament and peace were popping up in America and across the world. On September 8, 1966, NBC aired the first episode of its newest series, a space odyssey called Star Trek. Created by World War II veteran Gene Roddenberry, Star Trek was a show set in the 23rd century, portraying the explorations of a diverse cast of characters on a military starship. The episode briefly introduced its principal characters before opening with the now famous line, "Space, the final frontier." And with the callback to Kennedy's speech before the American people, the show picked up that pioneer spirit for equality, justice, peace, and yes, even space exploration that saturated the contemporary world and placed those ideas in the 23rd century. The show boasted characters who would boldly go where no man has gone before. But what audiences didn't know yet was that it meant exploration of social issues as well as strange new worlds. The original Star Trek is today often condemned as being rife with sexist and misogynistic attitudes, but taking a step back and looking at it through its time period shows that it is instead filled with attitudes consistent with second-wave feminism. One of the most common complaints is that the miniskirt and high boot uniforms worn by female officers are demeaning and objectify female professionals. However, in her memoir Beyond Uhura, principal actress Nichelle Nichols talks about the show being made in the age of the miniskirt. The costumes were comfortable, but more importantly, they were a symbol of sexual liberation. To Nichols, they were a symbol that, in the 23rd century, you are respected for your abilities, regardless of what you do or do not wear. The empowerment behind women's fashion in the 1960s looked incredibly different from the way it does today, but art historian Patricia Vettel-Becker has talked about how the costumes for female characters were designed in a way to make the characters empowered through their femininity instead of being empowered in spite of it. The attitude at the time was that the feminism of the Soviet Union focused on gender equality through the complete erasure of femininity. Whether or not this is true, it meant that the heroines of the American space race were made hyper-feminine. Characters were put in their comfortable miniskirts and went about their professional tasks. What Star Trek didn't do in the costuming of their female characters was turn them into space stewardesses, a trope common of similar shows at the time. In fact, the pilot made for the show in 1964 showed actress Majel Barrett as the ship's second-in-command. The character, called simply Number One, was responsible for the ship when the captain was incapacitated. This concept, a woman high in command in a military setting, was unprecedented for a show of the 1960s. And even though the show was restructured with the new crew after the pilot was shelved, it was unmistakable that these ideas of the liberated and professional woman extended into the final series. With the show airing at a critical time during the civil rights movement, its efforts to include a diverse cast of characters not only helped to push goals of the movement, but also gave minority representation in a way that gave characters of color a voice of their own. According to Dr. Daniel Bernardi, the show was able to use its futuristic setting to give lessons on racial issues from an outsider view. It portrays the Earth as being over its primitive, racist past, and yet it uses characters' relations with alien species as an allegory for different races. These allegories were used very often by the showrunners in order to get social issues past the NBC censors. A great example of this is the season 2 episode Journey to Babel, during which the audience discovers that principal character Commander Spock is the child of an interracial, or rather interspecies, relationship. He is a blend of two worlds, not wholly accepted by either one. His identity as a mixed species person becomes a central part of his character. Although both of his respective species tend to see him as other, the relationship of his parents is played completely straight and is as normalized as possible in order to present a future where interspecies marriages and children are not only possible but acceptable. This is notable because the episode came out in November of 1967, the same year that the federal case Loving v. Virginia legalized interracial marriage. Despite the importance of this character development, it is undeniable that actor Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock, was white, and his character's mixed heritage was certainly more acceptable to the censors. That said, the show featured recurring characters Lieutenants Uhura and Sulu, played by the African-American Nichelle Nichols and the Japanese George Takei, respectively. While both characters were incredibly important for the sake of representation, it is Nichols' character Uhura who made the biggest strides, having a large part in establishing an identity for Black women on television. The character was a professional, never spoken down to or ignored by her white male co-workers, and she was admired for her artistic talents as well as her professional ones. The character was nothing short of jarring to contemporary audiences. Actress Whoopi Goldberg, who would play a recurring character in Star Trek The Next Generation, recalled watching Nichols on television as a child and calling out to her mother, "Mom, there's a colored woman on TV and she ain't no maid." Nichols' presence on the show was a landmark for establishing positive, professional, and respected Black female characters on television, and thus helping to shape the audience's perspectives of them. Her strong presence on Star Trek had real-world benefits that she saw firsthand. In a 1968 interview, she discussed how her interactions with members of her community helped her to realize just how important her platform was for helping young Black people find pride in their racial identity and a reason to fight for justice. She was also invited numerous times over the course of her career to speak to young people of color about seeking career opportunities in both the arts and the STEM fields, including and especially at NASA. In Season 2, the addition of actor Walter Koenig and his character Chekhov would mean that the show, which centered on mankind's space achievements, would have a prominent Russian character. Chekhov, who spoke with a thick accent, was incredibly proud of his country of origin and would promptly proclaim that any invention or person of historical value was from Russia.
I know this saying. It was invented in Russia. The Garden of Eden was just outside Moscow. It was first mapped by the famous Russian astronomer Ivan Burkov. Well, not everyone kept in. It's a Russian invention. It was invented by a little old lady from Leningrad.
Chekhov's presence sent a message to the audience in no uncertain terms that the Cold War would end, and in the future, humanity would stand united, Americans and Russians alike. This is not at all to say that the showrunners tried to pretend that the Cold War wasn't happening. Quite the opposite. A Cold War allegory spanned throughout the entire show in the form of the Federation's own Cold War with the Klingons. Nicholas Sarantakes has written a piece about how the United Federation of Planets, comprised and proud of its many different species, acts as an allegory for the American melting pot to stand opposite the racially exclusive, land and power-hungry Klingons, who stand in place of the Soviet Union, and the militaristic, isolated Romulans, who are meant to stand in for China and North Korea. Showrunners loved the space, time, and setting, as well as the transportation abilities of the starship, because it meant that they could put their characters in any setting and any situation they wanted, and as long as they subbed in the word Klingon for Soviet, they could get away with talking about anything. Characters could act out allegories of current events like the Vietnam War or nuclear disarmament, and as long as they stuck to their fictional setting, they could squeak past the NBC censors. As the series went on, its Cold War allegories would match whatever was happening in real time. An example of this is the Season 2 episode The Doomsday Machine, where the Enterprise crew encounters a planet-destroying weapon out in space, destroying similar ships and en route to attack heavily populated planets. The goal of the crew becomes to destroy the weapon, even at the risk of their own lives. The allegory to nuclear weapons is not at all subtle, with a futuristic setting allowing for a disarmament message and the portrayal of American pride in taking out foreign nukes at their own risk. On multiple occasions, the Enterprise is shown to take them back to Earth's past, or planets that resemble it closely. Characters live through events that, in the public perception, Americans were the heroes of, like the defeat of Nazism. It hammered home to the audience that they, the Federation, and America by extension, were fighting for freedom in the past, the present, and the future. In the Season 1 episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, the show actually detours from its pro-pacifism message and presents a parallel future wherein America joins World War II later than they actually do, and as a result, the Axis powers win. It's a message that says war isn't inherently bad when freedom is on the line. It's the destruction of human life that must be stopped. The show was slated to be canceled after its second season, as it was no longer bringing in the ratings NBC anticipated. However, a letter-writing and protesting campaign by 1960s housewives, with whom the show was inexplicably popular, prompted NBC to renew it for a third and final season. While the third season was getting more extreme in its progressive views, advocating for abortion rights, tackling the assassination of social advocates, and displaying the first interracial kiss on television, the controversy surrounding its cancellation and resurrection was bringing enough attention to it to ensure that it lived on in the minds of more than just the women who are gathering at home fan clubs. The series would get a chance at resurrection in the late 1970s as Paramount sought a space-themed property to compete with the popularity of Star Wars. And in 1979, a full decade after the show went off the air, Star Trek the Motion Picture hit theaters. The film would prompt 5 sequels, a spin-off series called Star Trek The Next Generation, 4 films for the spin-off series, and 7 more spin-off series, 2 of which premiered in the year 2020. There's no doubt that the show has become a cultural phenomenon, speaking both to the persistence of that pioneer spirit in Americans, and the fact that the creator's willingness to attack even the most controversial of issues has paid off immensely.